Hello. In addition to being the SC21 General Chair, I'm also the Chair of the OpenMP Language Committee, and I'm participating in this Birds of a Feather in that role. So Michael and Johannes asked me to give an update on the current activities of the Language Committee with a focus on OpenMP 5.2, which we just released. So first of all, I want to just quickly highlight that OpenMP has a well-defined roadmap. We have a major release every 5 years, and our stated intent is to have a minor release that improves the major release 2 years after each major release. All right. We added OpenMP 5.2 as a second minor release before 6.0 because we realized that we had added this C++ attribute syntax for directives in 5.1, and we had made it so that it would cover all of the directives, but it was specified in a way that wasn't entirely clear. The syntax only showed the pragma-based and directive-based, pragma-based syntax for C and C++, and the directive-based syntax for Fortran. So we've done away with all of those, and instead have now just a single place that represents how each of the different mechanisms of specifying directives is what the syntax is for them. We also do minor, technical reports in between each of our releases. Typically, we have a technical report each November that we are not releasing a new version of the specification. And then also shortly before the release of an actual new version of the specification, we release a technical report that is the final comment draft that basically captures everything but the last minute fixes that results from our quality control process that we do before we issue the final release. The way we develop the spec is, somebody comes up with an idea, they propose it, we implement it in LaTeX, and then once we are convinced that it's a well thought out and good idea, we vote on it, and then we verify that it's been implemented correctly in the specification and merge it into the spec. That actual process of getting it fully implemented in LaTeX involves drafting, editing that draft, commenting on the draft, the final quality control version, and then that final draft that I mentioned that becomes the one that the ARB approves. All right, so we just released OpenMP 5.2 last week. The motivation for it is down here, where it's basically making it clear that the C++ attribute syntax is a first-class citizen of the OpenMP language. As we embarked on the process of doing that, we realized that we really could do a much better job at making sure that the syntax was of all the directives and clauses was well specified and consistent. Up until 5.2, we had syntax blocks throughout the specification, and oftentimes things like, well, this clause is optional on this directive would only be indicated by the way the syntax blocks was written. We've now moved to a version where we have where we have properties that we specify for the directives and clauses, and those really specify things like restrictions on the syntax. They're no longer just kind of hidden in the syntax blocks. We also made sure that we were much more consistent in how we specify restrictions, particularly on the syntax. And so generally, the 5.2 is basically like the result of a very large quality control process. In order to succeed in adding these improvements to the specification, we ended up moving to a database, an underlying database that allows us to generate large portions of the specification automatically. And that database takes the form of a large number of JSON files. And then those JSON files are parsed and used to generate portions of the specification. All of the section headers are now generated automatically from database entries. All of the key aspects of the directives and the clauses are generated from those. The modifiers are also captured in those database files, typically at this point in clause files. Whether we'll eventually have separate database files for all the modifiers is something we'll have to see. We also generate a large number of other portions of the specification, many of them automatically from the fact that we've captured syntax relationships between directives and clauses, and even some semantic relationships. So they're generated automatically, but any cross-reference that you see in the specification is now represented in a JSON file. We also generate most of the index entries out of the JSON files, and we generate a number of hyperlinks. So now every clause has a separate specification in the section, in the specification. And so if a clause may appear on a directive, it appears in a list of clauses that may appear on that directive. And then there's a hyperlink to the section on that clause. And for each of those, every clause, there's a list of the directives that it may appear on, and a hyperlink back to the specific directive that it can appear on. We think this will actually make the document a lot easier to use once you become used to the new organization of it. Here I go into a much deeper dive on what we've added into 5.2. I don't want to cover all of these in detail. I mentioned that we've basically defined a number of properties for the directives, the clauses, and the modifiers, and that allowed us to consolidate the restrictions and basically ensure that we're specifying them in a much more consistent format, and that they are specified more, that we're certain that they're specified when they should be, and that they're not just hidden in syntax blocks. We've also done a number of other things to kind of consolidate how we specify the syntax, including having common base language associations, base language code associations for directives. As I mentioned, well, no, I guess I didn't mention it, but we actually have deprecated a number of things as part of what we've done in unifying the syntax. This gives you a pretty detailed list. This gives you just about all of the deprecations and what they're replaced with. For example, you used to be able to annotate a Fortran allocate statement with an allocate directive, and it turned out that really didn't work very well given the other uses of the allocate directive. So we replaced that with an allocators construct that can only be used to, at this point, annotate Fortran allocate statements. Let's see. So what else in here might seem fairly important? Depends on what you're actually using. We now have allowed the allocate first private clauses on the scope construct. Basically, those were both the allocate clause was added at the same time as the scope construct, and we again didn't realize that. Oh, well, we should make sure that applies. This is the sort of thing that comes out of having a much cleaner way of specifying the specification and doing it through these database files. One thing that may be of interest is that we deprecated the minus reduction operator. As far as we could figure, nobody used it. It didn't really make a lot of sense. It was essentially a synonym for the plus reduction operator, which of course would be really confusing. 6.0 will continue a lot of the work towards getting the specification captured in a more regular way that's represented in this database approach that we've adopted. We will remove all of the features that we've deprecated in 5.0, 5.1, and 5.2. By the time we were done 5.2, it got to be a pretty good sized list. It's almost 2 pages, a list that's almost 2 pages long in and of itself. I expect that work to be happen throughout the 6.0 process and probably not be finished until 6.1 is finished. Some things you'll see early on in 6.0, like the dependencies and affinity for the task loop construct, which are basically already just about done. And so I would be pretty sure that they'll appear in TR11. A number of other things that we're looking at. Most of these are fairly far along. We've been working on 6.0 basically since we released 5.0, even though we were focused more on 5.1 and 5.2. But a number of these things are pretty far along, and so even if they aren't fully there in 6.0, I would expect some initial support for them at least in 6.0. And with that, I'm basically done. Hopefully, you think OpenMP is valuable and that you would like to see the ideas you have for improving it get implemented, get adopted. The best way to do that is to come out and participate, and you can do that either by coming to OpenMPCon and IWOMP, or you can actually get your organization to join OpenMP. We've added a lot of members recently. We've added different membership levels a few years ago, and we continue to grow. So with that, I'm done.